This is episode 246 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by James Taylor. He is the president of the Heartland Institute, which is a free market think tank based in Chicago, Illinois. They deal with a wide variety of issues of economic and personal liberty across our country, but we're mostly going to talk about issues of environment and energy policy, and mostly at the federal level, but it'll be a wide-ranging discussion. And welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, James.
Well, thank you for having me on, Paul. It's always good to talk with you.
Yeah, you were out in New Mexico a few years back, and again, you've been leading. I think you had told me a few years ago when you were here that you were going to be heading up the Heartland Institute. So, kudos on leading that organization, and talk a little bit about what Heartland Institute is all about, and especially your work on climate and energy issues, because I think that's really a big component of what you're known for.
Well, thank you, Paul. Yes, I'd be happy to. The Heartland Institute is a free market public policy organization. And what we stand for is individual rights, individual freedoms. So basically, our goal is to discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to the challenges that face society. And we put a lot of our emphasis at the state level. We are nationwide in scope, but we work within state legislatures and state-specific issues quite a bit, which is rather ironic because what we're known for is leading the fight against climate alarmism, which is an international and national issue. But back about 15 years ago, when this issue really started popping up, it was in the state legislatures that many of the renewable power mandates and attempts at carbon dioxide restrictions, et cetera, were being fought in the state legislatures. So our involvement there then just naturally grew into our involvement on more of the overall climate change issue. But we're looking for the free market solutions to this and other topic areas.
Yeah, and specifically, you have a piece that you wrote recently for Real Clear Energy, a website that deals with energy-related issues. So you're right in your sweet spot here, writing about Joe Biden's climate plan would be a disaster for the environment. Now, you could easily pin a column, Joe Biden's climate plan would be a disaster for the economy, but you take the environment angle, and that is something that I think a lot of people, casual observers, those who might not very easily understand or very well understand energy markets and the way renewable energy is actually created and delivered, that they might be surprised by. But talk a little bit about Joe Biden's energy plans as they exist. And, even, no matter what happens on Tuesday, we're recording this on Monday, this kind of mindset isn't going away. AOC and a lot of liberal members of the Congress on the Democratic side support these kinds of plans. So even if it's not Joe Biden, it could be some other insert presidential candidate or U.S. senator here. But talk about that plan.
Oh, I'd be happy to. And first of all, it wouldn't just be a disaster for the economy as well as the environment, but also it would be a disaster for our national security. And we can talk about that later too. But regarding the environment, the climate activist movement has successfully persuaded quite a few people into believing that the only environmental issue that exists is carbon dioxide emissions. And when you think about that, that's a rather nonsensical position. Think of all the fights for clean water, for clean air, for land conservation, for traditionally defined pollutants, et cetera. The climate activist movement would like us to forget all about that. Now, keeping that in mind, if we look at the Joe Biden energy plan, which would say zero emissions, zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. And you get there necessarily by eliminating all fossil fuels, as he has proposed to do. What does that mean? Well, a couple of scientists at Harvard University who believe in a climate crisis, these are folks who want to do something about carbon dioxide emissions. What they did is they mapped out how much of the nation's land mass would have to be devoted to wind turbines to produce the same amount of electricity that we're using today with wind turbines. And what they found is that we would need to cover 1/3 of America's landmass with wind turbines. 1/3 of our landmass. We would have to destroy all sorts of forests, all sorts of plains, coastal regions, etc. This would be a disaster for wildlife habitat, not to mention the birds and bats that are already being sliced to death in mid-flight by the millions. And by the way, that's before we even electrify transportation, because under the Biden plan, we would be required to have an electric powered vehicle fleet as well. And if you add the vehicle, the energy that would be required for that, now you'd be talking literally 1/2 of our landmass carpeted with wind turbines. That is the biggest environmental disaster I can think of. There is no outweighing benefit of perhaps mitigating a degree of warming over the next century that outweighs the environmental disaster of devoting half of our nation's landmass, half of our wilderness, etc., to wind turbines.
Let's take a step back because I think a lot of listeners and those watching this podcast may not fully understand exactly what candidate Biden is planning and how that relates to the Green New Deal. Of course, the Green New Deal is a suite of policies. AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman Cortez, is kind of the name that most people associate with that plan. But folks from right here in New Mexico, including Ben Ray Lujan, who is running for a Senate seat, and a lot of prominent names. I believe our senators Udall and Heinrich have both embraced the Green New Deal. Is Biden's plan the Green New Deal? Is it a variation of the Green New Deal? Talk a little bit about that nuance there.
Well, Joe Biden's plan is largely the Green New Deal. Now, he made a point in a recent presidential debate to say that no, he doesn't support the Green New Deal because he knows that that is politically damaging to associate himself with that particular plan. But nevertheless, his proposals are essentially the same. And what it entails is, as I mentioned earlier, he says he will get to zero emissions, zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. He's going to transition, by the way, that's a politician's word for eliminate, transition away from oil and other conventional energy sources. Now, by doing so, you will be imposing the most expensive and least reliable energy source on the American economy. And at the same time, you will be imposing all sorts of environmental harms that are unique to wind and solar power. Most of it would come from wind, not solar power, on the American economy. And by the way, that's just the energy component. So the resolution that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced in the US Congress, it's really interesting in that when you break down the costs of her plan, the cost would be a little more than $10 trillion in terms of the energy costs imposed on the country. But the majority of her plan really has nothing to do with energy. It's about imposing a socialist agenda on the country, guaranteed work for all, retrofitting houses, health care insurance for all. Basically, it is socialism with the hook of environmentalism, which they think will appeal to most people. And that's why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff, in an interview with the Washington Post, said, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, did you think that this was about the environment? Because we don't think of that at all. We think of it as a, how do you reform the entirety of society kind of thing. Now, if you look at the entirety of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed, the cost of that would be over $100 trillion, 10 times more than the energy components alone. So the energy components of the Green New Deal would be disastrous, whether it's AOC's plan or Joe Biden's plan. But if you allow the other components of what AOC would like to impose, and there's talk of her being in a cabinet level position in the Biden administration, it's much more expensive than that and much more destructive to American freedoms and the American way of life.
Now, you mentioned the issue of rare earth minerals and mining and all the things that go into wind turbines and solar panels, and those are considerable. Now, New Mexico has a plan, and we just heard in the last day or so that theoretically our state's largest utility is supposed to be out of coal completely by 2024. So just a few years from now, and they're on their way to 100% renewables. And obviously there's a lot that needs to go into wind and solar, but also presumably, and I don't know enough about Biden's plan, but you have to have something when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And I assume that's going to be batteries. First and foremost, does Biden's plan have anything to say about batteries, or does it get that specific? And secondly, talk about not just the wind and solar panels and the mining that needs to go in and what that entails, but also batteries are not exactly green technology.
Right. Two fantastic points. First of all, regarding batteries, we don't have the technology to store any significant amount of electricity energy in batteries. And his plan depends on the assumption that battery technology will make some great leap forward in the next few years, such that when the wind isn't blowing, such that at night when the sun isn't shining or if it's cloudy, that we can still have enough energy stored in batteries to deliver to the American people. And it gets to the point when I was mentioning before about how we'd have to cover half of the American landmass to deliver the electricity for our current use and the electrification of transportation. It simply cannot happen. And what it gets down to is this: what Joe Biden is proposing is something that he either knows cannot and will not happen, or he's just ignorant of the science involved. And what it boils down to is this: you're selling a bill of goods on this feel-good proposition that we are reducing carbon dioxide emissions and saving the environment. Not only are you harming the environment if you try it, but it simply cannot be implemented. In the real world, what will happen most likely is there will be a ramping up of renewable energy, but you will never get anywhere close to 100% carbon dioxide emissions free energy in that time frame. It simply can't happen. Now, secondly, as you mentioned, rare earth minerals, that's another component both of our environmental consequences of wind and solar power, as well as our national security consequences. Because right now, rare earth mining is about the most destructive environmental practice on the planet. We have rare earth minerals here in the United States, but there is almost no rare earth mineral mining because people wouldn't tolerate it. Exposés by the New York Times, by Yale University, and others have documented how this is just so tremendously awful for the environment. So essentially, China is the only nation that really encourages rare earth mineral mining because of the economic benefits that nation gets and the national security benefits. So 80% of rare earth minerals are produced in China, as well as most of the equipment, solar panels and wind turbines are produced in China. Now that imposes tremendous environmental damage on China, and people in China are starting to protest that. When Joe Biden says he's going to import those industries to the United States, there is no way the American people will, nor should they, accept that type of environmental destruction from rare earth mining in this country. And by the way, let's say that we went along that path anyway, and we decided that we would have a dramatic increase in wind and solar energy here. Then think about, for example, during the COVID outbreak, which is still ongoing, of course. But China, at one point, they threatened to withhold the medications that people utilize to treat and to lessen the effects of COVID-19. They used that as a bludgeon against U.S. policy. Now, think about if our entire energy grid is now dependent on wind turbines and solar panels that are largely produced in China, if we're entirely dependent on the rare earth minerals to produce them, then they have shown that they are not at all hesitant to utilize their position regarding rare earth minerals and wind and solar power equipment to, again, blackmail and sabotage United States foreign policy as well as our national security. So on multiple fronts, in addition to the economy, in addition to land conservation issues, this would just be a nightmare scenario for the United States. It might feel good to say that we are promoting emissions-free electricity and say that it's good for one aspect of the environment, But in the real world, it would just be, using Donald Trump's term, a disaster.
Now, before we head into other aspects of Biden's policies and energy in general, uh, let's talk about those CO2 emissions, because while I think your point is spot on that the obsession with just CO2 emissions as a metric for kind of broader environmental policies, and that being the sole measuring stick, is absolutely correct. It's interesting because America is actually doing a better job than even the European countries that have embraced the Paris Treaty, and certainly China in reducing those CO2 emissions. Now, we don't know what the fourth year of President Trump's time in office will look like, but I suspect, and I've seen data showing 5 to 7 or so percent CO2 emission declines, partially thanks to COVID-19. But the United States has been reducing CO2 emissions for some time. And, we were told, of course, this is going to be just the ultimate disaster as a Trump presidency, while by their metrics, we're actually doing quite well.
Absolutely. If you look at the emissions data from various nations, we right now are producing the same amount of emissions that we did in 1992, which is 20 plus years ago. Indeed, this century, we've reduced emissions more than any nation on Earth. And it's funny because we have the climate activists and their advocates in the European Union, in third world nations, et cetera, and they are constantly haranguing the United States for not signing on to their big government programs and joining their big government groups with all of their mandates, restrictions, and bureaucracy. Yet in the real world, there is no nation reducing emissions as much as the United States. Now, that's playing Al Gore advocate because, frankly, climate change has shown that the science regarding climate change is showing that we are not seeing the harms that have been projected. We're not seeing the increase in temperatures that were projected. But even if you're concerned about carbon dioxide emissions, we're reducing them. And why are we reducing them so much? We're reducing them because of growth in technology that's able to reduce emissions from conventional sources. And we're also reducing them because of the fracking revolution that has allowed producers to produce natural gas much more efficiently at much lower cost than was the case. So much of the coal power plants that we're seeing retired, some of them are being retired politically for natural gas, for wind power and solar power that are much more expensive. But much of it is also being replaced because natural gas is now cost competitive and in large scale, less expensive than coal power plants. So why would we want to subject ourselves to international governance, to the UN bureaucracy, to the same nations whose plans have failed to reduce emissions as much as we have, when we have our system of government, our free markets, and our allowance of natural gas fracking to reduce emissions more than any other nation in the world? That, my friends, is environmental progress. That is environmental protection.
And what are we talking about natural gas relative to coal and other energy sources? How much better for the environment is that?
Well, let's compare natural gas to coal. And by the way, even coal power is not that bad for the environment. It's certainly no worse than wind power with all the land use, with all the bird and bat kills, with all the rare earth minerals, et cetera. But even so, natural gas reduces carbon dioxide emissions by about half compared to coal. And then if we look at traditionally defined pollutants, the reduction can be anywhere from 60% to 90%. And we see that when we look at the principal pollutants that are tracked by EPA, we can see going back to 1980, for example, EPA reports that the United States is emitting 70% less of traditionally defined pollutants than was the case in 1980. And what's remarkable about that is poll after poll after poll, when people ask the American people if they feel that the quality of air in this country is getting better or worse, usually about 70%, 75% say they think it's getting worse. But our air is getting remarkably cleaner all the time as we utilize the benefits of a market-driven system and the technology advances that have come along with that.
All right, well, let's leave kind of electricity behind, at least for now, And when I think of the Green New Deal and those policies, the thing that jumps to my mind is that I know there's a big push against air aviation travel and kind of that aspect of what supposedly is bad for the environment. They're going to massively invest in trains, and of course, uh, I've been saying since the outbreak that many aspects of COVID-19 play directly as if they were policies imposed thanks to the Green New Deal. Certainly, the collapse in air travel is one of those. But talk about kind of mobility as the Green New Deal, and especially as the relevant portions from Joe Biden's agenda where would they take us?
Right. Climate activists would ban air travel if they could. That's been something that they have been promoting explicitly for a long time. Now, maybe a side benefit is it would take Nancy Pelosi 4 days to travel to Washington, D.C., even on high speed rail. But nevertheless, it's something that's impractical. It's something that the American people justifiably would oppose. So they don't talk about it much, but that's something that the climate activists are trying to ban. And by the way, if they really believed that air travel was so horrible for the environment, they would practice what they preach. If you were to do an internet search for Prince Charles and Davos, and then air travel or climate emissions, you'll see that before last year's World Economic Forum Summit, January 2019, in which Prince Charles lectured us all with Greta Thunberg about our carbon dioxide emissions, he had his own private jet hopscotching, hopscotching, flying all over the place from one place to another, to another, to another. Half the time the plane's flying empty just to meet him. And Prince Charles is not alone. You see this. Al Gore flies his private jet wherever he goes. And by the way, he doesn't take public transportation after he lands either. But the folks on the climate left, if they practiced what they preached, they wouldn't be flying into these international meetings. They wouldn't be flying around on their own personal travel, but they do so. They do so because they know that air travel is not nearly the issue or the problem that they would like us to believe. But nevertheless, the more they promote that myth, the more power that they accumulate in their own hands and at the expense of the American public and people around the world.
Well, I've seen photos of Kamala Harris coming off of planes, private planes, and I've seen information saying that Joe Biden has a private jet for his campaign. And back in the day, they not modern candidates in my lifetime, but it was quite common to do the whistle stop tour, and that's gone by the wayside. But the green campaign, if it were to happen, would definitely be a whistle stop campaign, not private jets flying around all over the country.
Yeah, let me just interject one point, if I may. Several years ago, when Al Gore was testifying in front of Congress in one of his most heavily promoted climate activism testimonies, it was amazing. I was watching the footage as it was happening. CNN, of course, touting Al Gore, the savior of the planet, the savior of the world. And they showed his private jet landing outside Washington, D.C. And then they showed a private limousine waiting to whisk him to Congress. Now, normal people, you and I, the ones who are vilified, we may fly commercial into Washington, D.C., which is a lot less carbon dioxide emissions per person than one person flying on his own private jet. And when I go to Washington, D.C., at worst, I'm taking an Uber or a cab. More likely, I'm taking the metro from Reagan Airport into the city. You'll never find Al Gore or any of his climate activists doing that. Similarly, when I was in Paris in 2015 for the Paris Climate Agreement, the discussions and the agreement there, it was amazing how the people who were there showing up on behalf of the climate activist groups were not utilizing the public transportation that my allies and I were taking from our hotels to the actual conference center. Instead, we saw, again, all the private cars, et cetera, pulling up there. It's remarkable the hypocrisy of these folks. And one other anecdote, about a year and a half ago, I was in New York City. We were filming an event with John Stossel here for the Heartland Institute. And it happened to coincide with the United Nations conference, forum, whatever it may be, discussion on climate change. So what we had is all of the heads of state and the NGOs coming into New York. Now I flew into LaGuardia, and the traffic was so horrible getting into the city because none of these people that are claiming that they're so concerned about carbon dioxide emissions were taking public transportation from the airport to Manhattan. They all had their private cars waiting for them, circling around the airport, etc. Again, if they believed what they were telling us, and if they believed in the restrictions that they would like the little people like us to abide by, they'd be doing the same themselves, but they don't do it.
Well, I can vouch that James does in fact fly commercial, having come out to New Mexico to do a Rio Grande Foundation event. We certainly didn't pay for any chartered air service for you. And
Nor a limousine, Paul. Come on, get with the program. I'm
I
on a
think
limousine.
picked you up and dropped you off at the airport myself. And so, yeah, it is very frustrating and quite incredible how much hypocrisy there is. And it really, I think the whole idea of getting across the country, high-speed rail is very far-fetched at this point. I mean, Obama poured all that money into California, and I have no idea when they're going to have a functioning train. Of course, Joe Biden is a big advocate for trains with all his commuting back and forth from Delaware while he was a U.S. senator. But what's the obsession with kind of the environmentalists and mass transit? I mean, here in New Mexico, we have wide open spaces. We're much less population dense than a New York City, a Washington, D.C., or almost any other state in the country for that matter. And yet we have the rail runner. We have a new bus system that was put there by a Republican in Albuquerque, a bus rapid transit system. It's a total boondoggle, even if people were comfortable using mass transit. It just seems like this is such a obsession for the environmental left. Why is that?
Paul, it's all about collectivism. Public transportation, mass transit is the ultimate expression of collectivism. And when we are driving in our own cars, we have the individual freedom that the left despises. When we're all forced to meet government imposed schedules or mass transit imposed schedules and travel all together, that's their vision of a perfect world. And one thing that's important to keep in mind when we are hearing this term high speed rail, that is simply not going to be the case even if you build this out. And I'll give you an example. Here in my home state of Florida, there was a proposal several years ago for high-speed rail. It was said, look, we have all these tourists flying into Miami, Tampa, Orlando, and the cities are separated. Tampa to Miami is a 4-hour drive. Orlando to Miami is a 3-hour drive. If we had high-speed rail, Disney World, et cetera, this would work great, and we would save all these emissions. Well, once they started mapping this out, unfortunately, voters rejected the plan. But while it was being considered, once you had politicians getting involved, everything changed. So, for example, Tampa to Walt Disney World or Tampa to Orlando, it's about an hour and a half, maybe a 2-hour drive. But folks in Lakeland, folks in Plant City, state legislators there and their constituents, they demanded that there be stops along the way there. And you cannot have high-speed rail when you're stopping every 10 or 20 miles, or the high-speed rail, the purpose of it is defeated because you're making stops, you slow down quite a bit. When you get near those cities, when you get there, you have to stop entirely. You wait for people to get on board, et cetera, and you've got stop after stop. Now, that would be the case whether it's at the state level in Florida or the national level. You're not going to have a train that's going from LA to New York. You're going to have a train that's going to go to LA and stopping in Bakersfield and stopping in Palm Springs and stopping in Las Vegas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people found this out in California as well. So the notion that high-speed rail will somehow give us transportation that's not quite as fast as airplanes, but still very fast, it's simply a myth. You might as well take a Greyhound bus or an Amtrak because that's about what you're going to get in the end anyway.
Yeah, the rail runner is the same way. It's not high speed even at its best. It's a regular heavy rail train. But unfortunately, and I have taken it more than one occasion, it is a very slow ride up to Santa Fe that in a car will take you 45 minutes. On the train, even if you're at the station, you're discounting the time from your own home to the station and then the time from the train station to wherever you're going. It's an hour and a half just for the point-to-point transportation. So it's really slow and relatively inconvenient. Now, I want to talk about more relating to vehicles, because California's governor is going to try to do 2035 zero gasoline sales of gasoline vehicles in his state. That's going to be incredible if he gets that done. But I suspect a future governor of California may not want to go forward with such a drastic policy unless major technological innovations are happening. And our own governor here in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, told folks last year that New Mexico by 2022's model year was going to be doing 52 miles to the gallon in its average for the fleet of vehicles sold. She hasn't actually put that into language, and I'm glad that she hasn't. But some of these drastic mileage requirements, or even the shift to electric vehicles, is just doesn't seem to hold up under further scrutiny there. James, what do you think?
Yeah, well, let's start with the electric vehicles issue. Do you remember how in the same state of California, just about a decade ago, we were told the hydrogen highway was going to be a reality, and all the money that was being poured into and was being planned for infrastructure, for hydrogen fueling stations, for hydrogen powered vehicles, et cetera? Turned out that didn't happen. When government planners tell us where they think technology will lead, we're setting ourselves up for quite an unpleasant surprise. And the same is true with electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are much more expensive than gasoline powered vehicles. The range is much shorter. And then when you do run out of your battery, it's not a 5-minute stop to fill up your tank like you do now. It's hours to charge your battery. This is something, electric vehicles are basically a play toy of the rich who have multiple vehicles, who can afford to take the electric vehicles when they're driving around town and can come back and recharge at night in their home. But it's not something that most people can have if they have one car, one vehicle that they have to rely on, whether it's a long trip or a short trip, whether they have a few minutes to fuel up or whether they can spend hours doing so. So saying that we're going to have this electric vehicle fleet, I give it as much credibility for scoring a real victory as Arnold Schwarzenegger's Hydrogen Highway. As far as the vehicle requirements for mileage, those mileage requirements, if they were to happen, and they're largely pie in the sky, politicians today set up these grandiose standards and deadlines that will be enforced after they leave office and are no longer accountable for them. Thus, they're very unlikely to come into existence, even if they were scientifically feasible. But the fact of the matter is, if you are going to increase mileage and reduce gasoline usage as much as they plan, basically we would all have to be driving Fiats like they do in much of Europe. At the same time, they would be very much less crash worthy. They'd be using lighter materials that are less absorbent of these crashes. And even then, you're still never going to get anywhere near 50 plus miles across the board. But again, if you do so, it's going to come at a high cost. It's going to come with a dramatic reduction in vehicle utility, where we're all driving these smart cars or Fiats, and that's about it. And it's going to come at the cost of safety. Now, if you remember the slogan, "No blood for oil," I wish that people on the left would apply that across the board rather than just to their pet causes, because these vehicle fuel mileage requirements and the dramatic cost on safety is essentially the embodiment of no blood for oil. In this case, they would be trading blood for oil.
Well, before we go anywhere else in our conversation, I just want to check with you and see if there's any other issues relating to both the utilities and the transportation aspects of our economy that I might have missed in this discussion. Anything else you're working on or you think is particularly important in this election that voters should know before they head to the polls?
Well, first, I'll mention, and thank you for the opportunity to do so, I'll mention some of our Heartland projects lately. We have a website that we launched this year. It is climaterealism.com. And on that website, what we do is we go through each day's climate scare of the day that's being promoted in the media, sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes three. And what we do is we present the scientific evidence that puts the claims in perspective and gives you a real point of view based on science, so that if you or your friend see something on CNN or read something in the New York Times and say, well, what about this? Doesn't that prove climate change exists, or whatever they say? You can get the real facts on climaterealism.com, updated virtually every day. We also launched a website, climateataglance.com. And here we have short, concise, easily understandable 1 and 2 page summaries of popular climate topics. So for example, we have a summary on hurricanes. You have 3 or 4 bullet points at the top to give you the cut to the chase facts about hurricanes. Then we'll have a short summary that gives citations and explains a little bit what we're doing. We'll provide usually a graphic that's easy to see and understand, and then links to other sources. We have that for hurricanes, tornadoes, polar bears, climate refugees, crops, droughts, you name it. And one other thing that I'd like to, and also we're doing a climate realism video series. If you go to the Heartland Institute's website, heartland.org, you'll see that we're presenting much of the climate realism, the daily updates, in video format. We have one of our young telegenic staffers, Andy Singer, what's the word I'm looking for? He produces them virtually every day, updating our climate realism topic. And one other item, not necessarily on the energy, environment, climate topic, but nevertheless, I think a very important one. We have a website that we recently launched. It is stoppingsocialism.com. And here we're providing the truth about the horrendous impacts of socialism around the world, presently, in the past, and what would be the case if we had the Bernie Sanders AOC and now Joe Biden agenda imposed on America. And I think that's a very powerful refutation, especially geared towards younger people who didn't live through the era of Soviet communism, who weren't exposed to the horrendous implications for the lives of people caught behind the Iron Curtain. And now they're taught to believe that socialism and even Marxism is no worse and no different than Sweden and the rest of Scandinavia. So those are some of our projects.
And folks can find out more about the Heartland Institute. How?
Heartland.org. And each of those other websites, climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com, and stoppingsocialism.com.
Yeah, before I move on to a few final questions before I let you go, I know a lot of folks who are around today voting and making decisions about politics don't remember socialism, don't remember true socialism. They mistakenly call Sweden or Denmark or Finland socialism. But when you talk about China today, as well as the old Soviet Union, socialism is not green in any way, shape, or form. Could you share? I know it's going back a ways, but you and I are old enough to remember those days.
Sure. The worst environmental destruction in the world was taking place behind the Iron Curtain. That's been widely documented. It's also something that I saw firsthand. A couple of years ago, I was in Munich for a climate conference, and on my way to Poland and provide a counter forum for United Nations climate conference there, I traveled through Czechoslovakia. So going from Munich, which was Western Europe, or excuse me, West Germany, and then cutting through Czechoslovakia and into Poland, getting a look behind the Iron Curtain, I still saw the horrendous vestiges of communism on the environment. You saw forests that had been clear cut. You'd see mines that had never been taken care of and restored after they were done. And people, although their living standards are going up, for example, in the Czech Republic, still they have higher priorities as they are still recovering from the Soviet communist era. You could see it with your own eyes. By the way, in Prague, I spent a couple of days in Prague, and one of the things that was most sad and yet inspirational, in Prague, they have a museum of communism. And I wish this would be the case throughout the world. What they had there, because they underwent communism themselves, they endured all the hardships, and they decided that after the Iron Curtain collapsed, that the Czech government, the Czech people, they decided that it was important to have a museum of communism where you had documentation of all the human rights abuses, of all the free speech infringements, of all the efforts of the government to stamp out individual freedom, even if it meant genocide in the process of doing so. And that also calls to mind, as we mentioned, Sweden and the Scandinavian countries. It's a shame that so many people equate that with socialism. Sweden and the other Scandinavian nations, it's a market economy. It's a market economy with a very generous safety net, social benefits. That's a far cry from the state government owning industry, the state and government deciding who works where and being the employer of people because they're the ones that are owning the industries and controlling the economy. That is far cry from Sweden, Scandinavia, and other nations. And people who try to tell you that democratic socialism is that, no, it's not. That's capitalism with a generous safety net. It's a far cry from what Bernie Sanders, AOC are proposing, which is more like Venezuela, where you see people to this day doing everything they can to get out and flee to a better life where free markets and individual liberties make life much more enjoyable and a higher standard of living than is the case under Marxism and socialism.
No doubt about it. Now, we've just got a couple minutes to go, and I want to ask you one more question, which is New Mexico, as I'm sure are aware, has a proud tradition of leadership and being involved in nuclear energy, whether it's nuclear energy or nuclear bombs, but I want to focus on nuclear energy. And it seems like if the environmentalists, instead of trying to shut down civilization, instead got behind nuclear energy as their zero carbon answer for so many of the problems they purport to claim, to care about, we could be in a much better position economically, and just taking a major kind of anti-capitalist viewpoint largely off the table. What's your take on nuclear power?
Yes, great points. If climate activists actually believed what they claim, they would be rallying in support for nuclear power throughout this country. Because as I mentioned, natural gas reduces emissions, carbon dioxide emissions from coal power at about 50%. Nuclear power reduces them by 100%. It is an emissions-free, both carbon dioxide emissions and traditionally defined pollutants. It's an emissions-free source. Moreover, it's available when there are clouds in the sky. It's available at night. It's available when the wind isn't shining or when the wind isn't blowing. Moreover, it comes without the extreme environmental harms that we talked about earlier for wind power and solar power. And on top of that, nuclear power is much more affordable than wind and solar power. The only reason why the environmental activists, the climate activists oppose nuclear power is because it is not their beloved wind and solar power industry. And for that, they will sacrifice their own claims of carbon dioxide emissions and climate change being the only issue that matters environmentally or really in any political context. They'll sacrifice that by shutting down existing perfectly good nuclear power plants, even when they know it's going to be replaced in some cases by coal power or natural gas power or whatever else that has some emissions. They'll sacrifice that because they don't believe what they're saying. They don't believe we're facing a climate crisis. And nuclear power's environmental impact is much, much less than that of wind power, for example.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, James. We will see how things shake out on Tuesday. Of course, some people will receive this podcast in their inboxes by not until after the election, but who knows? We may not know the results of the presidential election until after Tuesday. So this is timely. Of course, these issues are not going away. And I thank you for all those websites and important information. And once we get started again with in-person events, James, we'd love to have you back out to the land of enchantment. One of the most difficult challenges of 2020 was not having those good public events and speakers from out of state like we've come to enjoy. But I appreciate your time, and we'll see where things go.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's always a pleasure. And yes, truly, line up some events in New Mexico, and I'll be there tomorrow. I love the people. I love the land in New Mexico, and it's always a pleasure seeing you. But thank you for the opportunity today.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.